Welcome back, dear friends, to yet another lecture on postmodernism. In our last lectures, we tried to describe a parody, a pastiche, simulacra, virtual reality, black humor, constructivism, intertextuality, metafiction and historiographic metafiction. Now in this video, in this short lecture, we shall try to understand what is magical realism. Magical realism. Magical realism is another literary genre that is used in postmodern literature. So magical realism is a literary genre that primarily expresses a realistic view of the real world while adding some magical elements. You have an ordinary story and all of a sudden something magical, something extraordinary takes place in the realistic physical world. It is a fiction with the magical or supernatural presented in a real world in the mundane setting. So all of a sudden something supernatural appears in the realistic setting. Now magical elements appear in an otherwise realistic setting or in a contemporary setting. The characters in the fiction do not have any reaction to the magical things that is happening. The extraordinary becomes the ordinary. The characters themselves accept the magical as realistic. Now if you have seen the Malayalam movie Odiyan or the Malayalam movie My Santa, now these films contain a lot of magical elements presented in a realistic setting. Thus magic is normalized in the contemporary setting. That is magical realism. So magic is normalized in the contemporary setting. Magical realism is considered chiefly as a Latin American narrative strategy that is characterized by the inclusion of fantastic or mythical elements into seemingly realistic fiction. Now what are some of the characteristics of magical realism? Now this is a postmodern genre of literature which we need to learn. Let's see some of the characteristics of magical realism. The first characteristic is fantastic or magical elements. Magical realism portrays the fantastic elements in a realistic tone. It brings fables, folk tales and myths into contemporary social relevance. So fantasy traits are given to characters. That's the first characteristic. The second characteristic is a real world setting. The writers reveal the magical elements in the contemporary, this world setting. In the world of magical realism, the supernatural realm blends with the natural familiar world. The third characteristic is authorial reticence. What is authorial reticence? The narrator is indifferent. The story proceeds with logical precision as if nothing extraordinary has taken place. Magical events are presented as ordinary occurrences. The reader accepts the marvelous as norms and common. The fourth characteristic feature of magical realism is hybridity. What is hybridity? Magical realism plot lines employ hybrid and multiple planes of reality and takes place in a harmonious arenas of opposites like urban and rural, western and indigenous. There is also juxtaposition of opposite elements like dreaming and waking, life and death, etc. The fifth characteristic of magical realism is that it is metafiction. Now this characteristic explores the impact fiction has on reality, the impact reality has on fiction and the reader's role in between. Thus it is well suited for drawing attention to social and political criticism. That is the fifth characteristic. The sixth characteristic of magical realism is heightened awareness of mystery. The magical realistic literature tends to lead the reader to the awareness of life's connectedness or life's hidden meanings of mystery. The next characteristic is political critique. Now, magical realism contains the implicit criticism of society, particularly the elite. Magical realism was spearheaded by Latin American authors and is often read as a genre of political subversion. Just as the fantastic and magical elements are presented as normal, the standard structure of society is put into question. Magical realism is a chance for authors to show an alternative to an accepted reality, which can be incredibly powerful tool against political regimes, political corruption. Ultimately, magical realism uses magical elements to make a point about reality. There is a slight difference between magical realism and fantasy. Magical realism is not fantasy. While fantasy takes place in a made-up world, it takes place in an artificial made-up world, magical realism contains small magical moments that is happening in the real world. Fantasies like Harry Potter or Narnia do not make any claim to the real world. So fantasy takes place in a fantastic world, artificial world, but it takes place in magical realism, takes place in the real world. Now, magical realism is also not science fiction. Science fiction or scientific fiction shows what the world would be like if some scientific events had taken place. What the world would be like if some scientific events had taken place. But magical realism sets the magical events in the contemporary world. We need to remember one or two or three examples of magical realism. The first example that we can remember is the 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel G. Marquez. The 100 Years of Solitude. Like Water for Chocolate by Laura Esquivel is another example for magical realism, and the well-known work Midnight Children by Salman Rushdie is also another example of magical realism. We have heard about Midnight Children. This fiction by Salman Rushdie won him the Booker or Booker's Prize in 1993. Midnight Children is linked with a style of writing or technique that incorporates magical or supernatural elements into realistic narrative without questioning the improbability of these events. So my dear students, we have discussed that topic called magical realism, which is a genre in the postmodern literature. The magical realism combines some magical or supernatural elements with the actual contemporary historical setting, real setting. So in a magical realism fiction, the characters or the readers does not realize that the magical elements presented are magical. It is taken for granted and presented as happening in the realistic world. So magical elements, fantastic elements are presented in contemporary real world setting. My dear students, you have listened to a short lecture on magical realism. Please prepare your own notes based on what I have discussed and also based on other sources of information that you can gather on magical realism from the internet, YouTube, etc. Have a joyful learning. Please stay safe at home. Have a nice time. Thank you.